In this lecture, I'm going to go through some of the key concepts related to water-soluble vitamins. As I mentioned in the intro to this unit, I'm not going to go into necessarily every little detail of every vitamin that you can read about, but I want to hit on some of the key concepts that I want you to be thinking about throughout and some of the things that you'll want to be able to relatively quickly reference. So first of all, this is an image that just kind of breaks down some of the general things about water-soluble vitamins. I'm assuming that this is to some extent a little bit of review for you, but just to kind of remember and put things in context, the water-soluble vitamins are comprised of vitamin C and then the B complex vitamins. So all of the various B vitamins. Vitamin C has kind of its own functions that we'll look at, and then the B complex vitamins can be kind of grouped into some general functions. So there are some of the B vitamins that are energy releasing, meaning that they don't have energy, because remember in nutrition, when we say something has energy, it means it has calories and can release that, has energy to be used. But the B vitamins are energy releasing because they're involved in the metabolic pathways that break down and metabolize the macronutrients, so the carbohydrate, protein, and fat, so that that energy can actually be realized or utilized, released. So the energy releasing include thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, pantothenic acid, biotin, and B6. And then there's the hematopoietic. So these are related to blood, blood cell development, growth, maintenance, those kinds of things. So folate, vitamin B12, vitamin B6, and pantothenic acid are all involved in blood types of things and blood cells. And then other general functions, which there's a variety of B vitamins that are involved in other functions as well. So B vitamins are actually quite expansive in their function and absolutely essential. They are also pretty widely available in food sources, which makes sense. Typically, when our body has a lot of a need for some particular nutrient, we find that it's pretty widely distributed, but certainly deficiencies can happen. So anyway, this is just to kind of get you back in the mindset about what the water-soluble vitamins are and how you can kind of start grouping them a little bit in your mind. This is a table that there's lots of similar tables out there, nothing that I expect you to memorize, but these are absolutely things I would want you to be able to quickly reference. So this basically goes through each of the, or a portion, this is sort of a part of a table that would go through each of the B vitamins, looking at what some of the functions of those B vitamins are, what the deficiency and or toxicity symptoms might be, food sources of those, what the RDA, or recommended dietary allowance, would be. Along with that, and again, I expect that this is refresher, but remember that the DRIs, which is dietary reference intake, is like the broad umbrella, and under that you have the RDAs, recommended dietary allowance or adequate intake, AI, one of those. And then for some vitamins and minerals, as we get to that, there may also be a tolerable upper limit, which lets us know that that is more likely to have some toxicity symptoms. So it's important that you're able to locate relatively easily some sort of a table or reference for these vitamins that let you know what the roles are, what the function, key or common deficiency or toxicity symptoms, if those apply, what the RDA would be, and some food sources of those. So again, just make sure you have that available for reference. So this image highlights some aspect of nutrient absorption and transport. So we've looked at this in this class before generally, but I want to think about it in terms of vitamins and kind of some refresher here. So remember that cell membranes are lipid bilayers, so anything that's water soluble is going to need some type of carrier to get across it because it can't flow in that hydrophobic environment. So water soluble vitamins would of course be in that category. So they need, some way to get across the cell membrane. So kind of remember that issue of active versus passive transport, that active requires energy and passive does not require energy. So often molecules move with the concentration gradient to try and keep at an equilibrium, but that's not always true. But if it's moved against a concentration gradient, that's when energy is going to be needed. So it can't just flow freely in that case, or flow without energy, I should say. It doesn't flow freely either way, but it will need energy if it's moving against the concentration gradient. So in terms of carrier or channel mediated pathways, there's a limit to the number of those carriers or channels. So that's another thing to really consider when we think about nutrient transport. Really, once those carriers or channels are saturated, they're full, more of the substrate is not going to make more get into the cell until those transporters are sort of emptied, so to speak. So there's really only so much our body can transport or move into a cell at one time. So this also kind of provides some thoughts about assessment of nutriture. So in other words, how do we know if someone has enough vitamin B6 or whatever? Do we just test the blood for vitamin B6 or do we have to do something else? So when we check blood levels, it doesn't necessarily equate to cellular levels because of how things are transported in. So often the blood level of a nutrient is really not a good way to assess the body's nutriture. So that's just something to really consider when you're thinking about how would I assess the status, someone's status of a particular nutrient, determine whether the blood level is appropriate or if there's another way to assess that. So the other thing is that if something is malfunctioning with the carrier, the blood levels may be very high while the cellular content is actually low. So just again, something to consider there. As we look at water-soluble vitamins, vitamin C is one of those examples of a nutrient that requires a transporter. So it requires SVCT1 and 2 as its transporter. So let's think about regulation of these transporters or carriers. In biological systems, you don't want too much of a substance being absorbed, even if a lot's present, because that could cause problems. So because of that, there's almost always some sort of negative feedback mechanism that really sort of shuts off, so to speak, the functionality of the transporters if there's just too much of that substrate available. So if there's just too much of the nutrient, then something provides this negative feedback to tell the body, well, sorry about that. So to tell the body that to kind of shut down and not absorb more. So that's kind of where with B vitamins, I wanted to bring this up here. So this concept that if we have too much of some particular nutrients, so like water soluble vitamins, you also often hear this with the B vitamins, that if we have too much, we'll just pee it out. So we don't have to worry if there's too much because it'll just go out in the urine if it's water soluble. So to some extent, yes, the body does decrease how much is being absorbed and then excretes the excess in the urine with water soluble vitamins. However, before you totally sort of embrace that concept, I'd really encourage you to consider the complexity of the human body. So those nutrients still have to go through the full metabolic cycle before we excrete them. So consider whether other things may happen before we excrete them. So maybe they bind with other nutrients, or maybe they compete with other nutrients for transporters, or those sorts of things. The other thing is then they still have to go through the kidney and be filtered out that way. So on the flip side of that, the body also often has systems for increasing the rate of absorption if too little substrate is present. This is actually true for vitamin C. So if you eat a lot of vitamin C, the body will absorb a smaller percentage of it, whereas if you eat a small amount of vitamin C, the body will absorb a larger percentage to kind of help mediate that. So I think that's one thing that's really impressive, how the body really sort of helps compensate to some extent, although we can end up pushing that too far. So oxidation reduction reactions is another common rule, I guess, to talk about when we talk about vitamins. A lot of vitamins and minerals function in oxidation reduction reactions. So they, in that case, generally serve as an antioxidant. So remember, oxidation reduction reactions essentially just move electrons from one compound to another. So the compound that is reduced gains an electron, so you can think of it as reducing the positive charge, and the compound that's oxidized loses an electron. So remember, we can't just have electrons floating around freely, so those oxidation reduction reactions happen together, and they're sometimes referred to as redox reactions. So that way it sort of takes care of the electron issue. So the image on the screen here, again, just to use it as an example, this image shows how vitamin C works in an oxidation reduction reaction. So you all have probably heard before that vitamin C helps with iron absorption. That's kind of one of those basic nutrition 101 type questions, so to speak. So vitamin C helps with iron absorption, but we may not really think about how that happens, and this really illustrates that. So essentially, iron exists in two different forms in an aqueous environment, such as the blood. The ferric form, which is the 3+ form, which you see on the screen here on the right, and it also is in the ferrous form, which is the 2+ form, or the reduced form, and that's the form that's more easily absorbed. So this kind of shows you how that reaction can help with transitioning, how that reaction with vitamin C, so we start over here with ascorbate, and move to over here, although my little drawer isn't working. And in the process, then iron is also changed into that more absorbable form. So this is just, again, one example, but you can keep that in mind as you learn about other nutrients and their function in redox reactions or function as an antioxidant, for example. This is kind of how you would think of that. Another general function to talk about is the role of B vitamin being a coenzyme. So many of the B vitamins function as coenzymes. So I think it's helpful to, again, remember what that means. So remember, enzymes are proteins, but sometimes for the enzyme to actually function, you need another coenzyme. So over here, the apoenzyme, or what we would think of as the enzyme. But without this coenzyme involved, which is typically commonly or I guess I should say B vitamins are, that's a common role for B vitamins, is to serve as a coenzyme. Without that coenzyme present, you can see that the structure of the apoenzyme, or the protein portion of the enzyme, just doesn't allow the substrate to fit. And so in that case, it needs the coenzyme before the substrate can actually bind. So that's, again, a common function of B vitamins is to serve as coenzymes, and this is how they play that role. So even if we have the enzyme present, even if we have plenty of the substrate, so maybe glucose or whatever it is that we're trying to do something with, without the coenzyme, we can't move forward in the reaction that we're hoping to accomplish. So whatever the metabolic reaction is that's trying to move forward.